Today, I'm going to highlight the importance of educating your employees about cybersecurity within the workplace. So let me set the scene first of all. When I started at Microgaming in 1998, I set up the IT department. Back then, the main threat was from viruses and getting stiffies or memory sticks into the environment, and that's how we protected everyone. Later on, denial of services became an issue, and we had to spend millions on preventative measures. I even recall receiving an extortion request for $100 to stop one of the attacks. Needless to say, we didn't have to pay because we had enough protection. Since then, the hackers have leapfrogged the tech industry, as we've seen this morning. And because of this, they can now target humans. Because of this, it makes attack strategy really difficult to prevent. So, if you think your environment is safe and secure and you're immune to cyber incident, pay close attention to what I'm going to say today. If you use the internet, you can be compromised, and there is no protection out there that can stop it. Okay, so according to the World Economic Forum, 95% of cyber attacks are a result of human error. That's a frightening statistic. Are you part of that elite group who won't ever make a mistake? Today I'll try and break down why none of us are infallible and why as business leaders we need to put processes in place to prevent the inevitable. Right, so let's dig in. Would you agree that we are an arrogant species? We can consider ourselves to be highly evolved. We think we have superior brains. I can see some of you nodding. We feel we're in control of our beliefs and behaviors because the alternative, that we're not in control, and worse yet, that we can be manipulated, is frightening. And yet history is brimming with countless examples of how reasonably intelligent people can be made to do things other reasonably intelligent people would never consider. You don't have to scroll far through your favorite streaming TV subscription to find examples. And if you want an example closer to home, what about going to Peel on New Year's Day? Have you heard about the phrase neuromarketing? Well, it's been said that people buy things based on emotions. They then justify this purchase using logic. In other words, the smallest part of our brain, our emotions, drives the largest part, which kicks in afterwards to rationalize the behavior. Many companies use this understanding of neurological science to entice our lizard brain into buying their goods. A whole industry has grown up because of so-called neuromarketing, because it works. Countless studies have proven it repeatedly, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that these same principles are being used by nefarious people for bad intentions. So what has this got to do with hacking humans? Well, your people, Bob in accounts, Mary in reception, or even you are all easy targets. They've gotten wise to how the human mind works, meaning they're preying on our fears and our doubts and uncertainties and making a lot of money out of it too. Today I'll go through why social engineering has become an important tool for criminals to extort and make money from all of us. I'm sure all of you have been exposed to text, phone, email scams. And if you go onto any social media site, there are loads of examples of clickbait scams which are used to encourage users to participate or click on a link. Most people don't even know that their online account has been compromised. Distinguishing between good and bad can be difficult, but if it appears to be good to be true, don't take the bait. Clickbait is a great example of how humans can be manipulated for nefarious reasons. For those of you who are wondering what clickbait is, well, these are the headlines designed to influence unknown behaviors on social media and to get users to comment or click on a link. By opening the link, they could be inadvertently exposed to a cyber threat, or worse, create behaviors that are replicated in the workplace. And this is really important because what you do at home, you're likely to do at work. It's a clever system, really, when you think about it, as hackers exploit our known knowledge and use what we share against us. They navigate our emotions and vulnerabilities by leveraging psychology to open the door to our bank accounts and to our organizations. We heard about COVID-19. It had the added risk of creating social engineering scams, and it's a great example of how they explore our weaknesses driven by fear during an already significantly stressful time. Cyber criminals have no scruples. They will do whatever they have to manipulate a monetary reward. They use fear and uncertainty and doubt to create an atmosphere of heightened stress to manipulate people into making irrational choices. So, how does social engineering work? Well, the following question will help you understand the term social engineering. Is it easier in general to persuade, lie, and manipulate a person to get important information, or to break into their network or software to get the same information? Think about this example. A fraudster wants to know a certain login and password to access the company's bank account. Would it be simpler to fool the company's accountant or to find a vulnerability in the software? The answer is easy. Persuading and manipulating people requires a lot less effort and ends up being very effective. When we talk about cybersecurity, this tactic is called social engineering. So, let's go through some examples of social engineering attacks. Well, there are many, from phishing to emails, to phone calls, text messages, search engines, URL phishing. There are baiting attacks through email attachments, social engineering attacks through means of developing a relationship and pretext. Which leads me on to, have any of you watched The Tinder Swindler? It's a great example of social engineering through trusted manipulation. While this is not related to cybercrime, it's a good illustration of how humans can be manipulated. It's a British true crime documentary which tells a story of an Israeli con man who used the dating application Tinder to connect with individuals who he then emotionally manipulated into financially supporting his lavish lifestyle on the pretext that he needed the money to escape his enemies. I confess, I did watch this, but only to help me understand how the con man was able to manipulate intelligent women into parting with their money. And I'll make a note here. The intelligent women weren't rich spouses who had loads of money. These were your average day-to-day women who they got led on by a criminal. And he cycled the money between the women. It's worth watching, if only to understand why your business is at risk. So, are you starting to get the picture? Let's look at the tools most commonly used. When phishing emails first started, it was mostly from a Nigerian prince wanting you to deposit a small amount of money in exchange for a large amount. These types of campaigns had a low success rate. However, there were people who were desperate enough to fall for them at the time. Since then, their sophistication has improved significantly, making them difficult to spot. If you think about the Queen's death recently, they targeted mourning victims into either clicking on links with a malware payload or encouraging them to pay funds towards the cost of the funeral. Can you spot the two calls to action on the screen? Remember what I said earlier about intelligent people doing unreasonably or unintended things because of emotion? Think about the period leading up to the funeral and how your emotions could have been influenced by a nefarious actor. By the way, and this is a nugget, if you are inundated with spam or phishing, your exchange and email filter might not have been configured correctly. This is an important mitigation strategy to try and prevent unwanted attempts. Okay, so hopefully many of you would have spotted a simple phishing attack. However, what about a spear phishing attack? So a spear phishing attack would be if they target you directly. How many of you, after receiving a barrage of emails from an apparently legitimate website to your work address, would click on the link to unsubscribe without checking the URL? Phishing can come in many different disguises, and why they've been so successful in fooling end users. So why are we the weakest link? Well, we spoke a little bit about technology. Ignorance helps technology survive. Evolving technology is overtaking every part of our society today. In today's world, almost everything has gone digital. We now save data on the cloud, choose services like Amazon, who allow us to store credit card information to simplify our online purchases. We interact with people around the world using Zoom or any of the other video conferencing software that got us through COVID. Think about how Alexa or Siri has changed our behaviors, not to mention the plans Meta has for us in their virtual world. The point is, there can be no denying we live in a connected society where we cannot do without the internet. We've created the perfect environment for criminals to take advantage of either inexperienced users or weaknesses created by vulnerabilities in the way we interact with the connected world. You know, I often joke, Microsoft and Apple are my best friends because they keep introducing bugs and software features that allow the attackers in. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a job. Obviously, it's never malicious intent, but rather a result of trying to keep up with technology. Software updates have increasingly become security updates rather than feature releases. We now have a specific day of the month dedicated to this called Patch Tuesday, which was yesterday. And it's not just these two giants, but all software companies who unfortunately are at the mercy of bug hunters looking to make money from vulnerabilities. Along with the interconnected world come devices which facilitate our experience. Recently, I was going to Turkey and was discussing my plans with a colleague next to me. Later that evening, when she opened one of her social media apps, for the first time, she received advertising about cheap shopping in Turkey. Coincidence? Or was that device listening to our conversation? Now, ignoring the Turkey reference, obviously her app knows that she likes to shop. I'm sure there are many of you who've had similar experiences based on something you've been discussing. Most users today don't understand device security and are oblivious to the risk we face online. Most of us here today will either have had Facebook hacked or know someone who has. These same examples can be carried through to our business because, as I said earlier, the same behavior at home carries to our business and why we're all at risk. And more cybersecurity professionals across multiple industries are waking up to the ugly reality that people within the organization pose the biggest risk. So let's talk a little bit about examples of why people can't be trusted. Have you heard about the Uber cyber incident recently? For those of you who haven't, they were hacked by a 17-year-old who used social engineering to target an employee using two-factor authentication prompts. He created an environment where this particular user had heightened stress and was in a place where IT assistance was welcomed. Calling the user, the hacker claimed to be IT support and was able to get him to click on a link and divulge his credentials. From there, the attacker moved laterally and then elevated their permissions through credentials found within their own internal systems. Several critical systems were compromised and the data was exfiltrated, which is going to haunt Uber for a long time to come. Now, it's worthwhile noting that Uber spends a significant amount of money on cybersecurity. They have state-of-the-art systems which monitor and protect, and yet an attacker was still able to get in. This is also their second major breach. The failing, a human who ignorantly thought he was interacting with an authorized admin user and a developer who left privileged credentials inside code that could be accessed by non-privileged accounts. The lesson learned from Uber is that to keep ahead of the ever-evolving challenges of cyber threats, the leadership of companies and organizations need to not only focus on external threats, but also internal threats. Which, while it is good to invest in advanced software tools and technologies to deter such attacks, you also need to look at the internal threats and design your business and data to factor this in. Don't overlook the fact that your biggest threat lies in your organization. Employees, trusted business partners, vendors, and contractors intentionally or inadvertently leaking sensitive information are fast emerging as the biggest threat to an organization's IT security. Did you take note? It's not only the people, it's also the vendors and business partners who create risk. Right, let's look at the type of threats, and I'll try and help you understand what the risk is. I'll start by looking at the negligent or inadvertently negligent employees. While most employees don't have malicious intent, they can cause a data breach because they're just casual or careless, or unintentionally leak sensitive data or information. Unsuspecting employees may commit the mistake of opening a phishing email or downloading content that may contain malware, or sharing information and documents with the wrong person, or may even be tricked into providing sensitive information without realizing it. Negligence of employees can also lead to credential theft, which occurs when a user's credentials have been obtained unknowingly from such users by malicious attackers to gain the organization's network and steal critical data. So the next one would lead me to financial loss due to credential theft. In 2021, 50% of all phishing attacks were related to credential theft. These are the costliest per incident. Why? Well, because they create an entry point into the organization and criminals know where the weakest link is. Here are some examples. Phishing, fraudulent communication, sent via emails that appear to come from genuine sources. The purpose is to steal sensitive information like login information or implant malware on the victim's machine. What about social engineering, where the criminal actors fool the victim to part with their credentials or sensitive data by impersonating someone in your organization? Recently, I saw someone buy a Manx Telecom t-shirt. If someone had a supplier's t-shirt and walked into your organization, would you trust them? Let me ask you the following question. Do you monitor the use of work emails for private use? Do you educate staff that they should not be using their work email for private use? Last year, more than 15 billion stolen passwords were available for criminals to use. Now, these passwords have accounts associated with them. Why is this relevant? Well, there are many sites that have been compromised. If you use your work email and don't use a password manager, which I'll come to later, but use similar passwords because we're lazy, they create a correlation and potentially allow them to guess what the current password is. In fact, last week, we dealt with an Exchange account takeover incident, which occurred because the user's account had previously been compromised and the threat actor could easily guess the password. I think if we looked at the logs going back, he only had 5 attempts and he was able to get the password. There's even a free site when you can check if your work or email address has been compromised, just in case it wasn't. So there's Google Mail that you can look to see which accounts have been compromised. Apple has similar functionality. If your account has been compromised and you go onto the site, the important lesson is that you should remove that password, preferably use a password manager. Remove the password theme from all future sites and make sure that you change passwords on any sites that had similar passwords. And I state this because we're all lazy. We're all creatures of habit. Just because you create a safe island does not mean that you will be safe, as an example where Twitter was compromised. In July 2020, hackers gained access to more than 130 Twitter accounts, with at least 1 million followers to promote a Bitcoin scam. Some of the personalities that were hacked included Barack Obama, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and several others. And while the hacker what the hacker did is target employees working from home, got credentials, and then used local administrative tools to change the user's accounts. By using these credentials, they gained access to internal tools and sent out messages promoting the scam. In the messages, can you see how hackers created trust and then a sense of urgency with the Twitter message? We see this very often in phishing exercises where the user feels like they have to respond. Then lastly, what about developer negligence? Your own internal people creating mistakes. Last month, Australian telecom giant Optus was compromised. The incident reportedly started with the attacker accessing an API server that was not protected with any type of authentication. In other words, the attacker didn't even have to log in to get access to the data. He was able to get more than 11 million personal details from Australian citizens. And to put that into context, that's 40% of their population. Just because you spend a lot of money on cybersecurity does not mean processes or applications within your organization can't be flawed to allow hackers in. Right, so enough scare talk. Let me talk about what can be done to prevent humans from being hacked. So let's start off with, would you agree that all humans, if they want to do something, they'll find a way to do it? Whether it's intentional or unintentional, this often requires circumventing rules that were put in place to protect us. Therefore, to reduce the risk of cybersecurity incident, process is important, not to enforce users into changing their behavior, but rather to identify the risks and put preventative measures in place to reduce the risk. You may not always understand the technical implementation, but ensuring that everyone understands why they're the weakest link helps inspire staff to take ownership of their own cybersecurity. Thinking that IT will take care of it is totally the wrong approach. In a lot of companies we speak to, we see that while they do training, it doesn't come from the top down, and that's why this point is really important. When considering the security of your organization, one of the key pillars is knowing your environment and understanding what you're protecting. Any cybersecurity certification which validates your protective measures will focus very heavily on asset management, not just the physical, but also the digital. The Art of War by Sun Tzu is often quoted in cybersecurity circles because it focuses on knowing your enemy. If you understand your enemy, you have a higher chance of defeating them. Following a process ensures you identify and then protect what is valuable, ensuring your business is suitably protected. A process is knowing that humans are the weakest link, fallible, and so need layers of protection to mitigate bad behavior. So what are the human risks? Well, I've focused on the scenarios which have led up to vulnerabilities, what you need to be doing to protect it. Let's dig into actually what the risks are within your business. Could you or your staff be guilty of any of the following bad habits? These examples are a reminder of my previous statement. Humans are lazy and creatures of habit. I may not be a behavioral scientist. However, it doesn't take a genius to see that unless you take responsibility for enhancing your online habits at home and in the workplace, that we're going to become victims of cybercrime. Maybe you should consider investing in a password manager like LastPass. We use from banking apps to dating apps, they all need different passwords. Most internet sites now require us to register. Creating unique and strong passwords can get tricky fast. Some people use simple passwords that are easy to remember. Others memorize one complex password and use it everywhere online. Either option is a recipe for disaster in the form of identity theft or an account takeover, so don't do it. Password managers are apps that generate new random passwords for all sites you visit and store it so that you can access it. They store these credentials for you in a secure virtual wallet. We're all guilty of weak password behavior. The only way to change that is either to have photographic memory or a password manager. This is a really important point because there's very few businesses that require this for their staff. So let's look at weak authentication, which is part of the login process. Authentication is a vital part of any website or application since it's the process of recognizing user identities. Several common categories of authentication can result from vulnerabilities in login credentials, site protection, or even underlying code. And because of the risk of cyber compromise during an authentication process, many sites now recommend multi-factor authentication, or MFA. If you want to secure your workplace today, MFA would represent an access control card, your password, and a security guard or the receptionist who would validate anyone coming into the building, your MFA account. Why is MFA recommended? Well, if a hacker compromises your password, the additional login authentication requirements would prevent further compromise. Most applications today, social media, banking, sensitive websites now recommend MFA. So don't become a victim. Enroll your account today. It's simple, it's free, it's easy to do, and if you're not sure how, Team Riela is around and available to help. It's important to highlight that MFA is not infallible, as in the example of Uber. It can be circumvented, and it can create a false sense of security. However, training can get around this. Right, so up to now, I've had a strong focus on how users can be compromised or bad habits that create ignorance. What about the people that are supposed to protect us? What about our IT security specialists or IT people? They are not prone to making mistakes, and why it's imperative that you should externally validate to make sure there's no mistakes in your IT environment. To a non-technical individual, how can you irrevocably trust people you work with or pay to ensure that you're adequately protected? The only way is to trust but verify. And we would always recommend anyone who's investing money in cybersecurity to include in their budget external verification of their services. I'm yet to see a penetration test given to a company come out with a clean bill of health, even if they have a large team of cybersecurity engineers. One of the ways to verify trust is to go through some form of cybersecurity certification. This requires that all elements of the environment are documented, and during the process it should highlight any of the misconfigurations or gaps in your cybersecurity or IT configurations. A great entry-level certification is Cyber Essentials, which we heard about earlier. This is a self-assessment. It follows similar principles by asking the question, what are you doing about the basics of cybersecurity? And so highlights the gaps. And I'll highlight the word basic because cybersecurity doesn't have to be complicated. So earlier I mentioned Sun Tzu, knowing your enemy. Well, let me go through asset and patch management. Why would an asset be associated with human failure? Well, the common exploits for cyber criminals is via unpatched systems, which have identified vulnerabilities. I hope that everyone in this room today knows the importance of patching your Microsoft or Mac system as soon as the software becomes available. These always contain important security updates for vulnerabilities that have been identified. Mobile phones should also be included and patched within a week of the patch being released. For those of you in the audience who have moved to the cloud, I only have time to scratch the surface, but it needs to be highlighted that one of the biggest misnomers in recent IT technology is that just because you've moved to the cloud does not mean that you are protected. In fact, when you install the basic version of cloud, it is unsecure. All you've done is transfer your IT assets to an externally hosted environment, which while it will be maintained and patched, suffers from the same security flaws as you might see in a normally hosted environment. The cloud can be secured. However, it does require investment in solutions designed to protect your data. The benefit of the cloud, obviously, is that someone else is looking after the patch management. There are many more IT devices which could be vulnerable and should be patched. When last did you connect to your home router? What about the printers at home that have been in your home for the last 10 years? Many of these devices would not be considered a threat. However, cyber criminals use them to infiltrate and then move laterally until they find systems that can be manipulated. Lateral movement means an attacker can use a compromised device to move to a different device on the same network. They gain an entry point and then they hop until they can find a compromised system where they can elevate their permissions. So what keeps me up at night? Well, I'm most scared of zero-day vulnerabilities. And while we monitor all traffic, which is key to mitigating cybersecurity exploits, did you know that a zero-day vulnerability can exist for a very long time before it's patched? Now, zero-day vulnerability is a vulnerability that is discovered and then needs to be patched. So once the company is notified, the zero-day starts. However, that vulnerability could exist for a very long time. Vendors like Microsoft and Apple will get a vulnerability patched within 90 days of it being classified. However, what about the smaller vendors? Think about your hot tub or my bra. What about security cameras? Do you think these vendors really bother about security flaws that allow lateral movement? Knowing these vulnerabilities exist, even though our systems are patched, helps to understand why our systems remain at risk and why I focus so heavily on the people within your organization. So, how do threat actors attempt to hack humans? Again, I'm going to go back to the Uber example. It doesn't take much to find a weakness, to get an employee, to give the criminal access to your environment. Social engineering is one of the biggest risks. So businesses, because people think that their private life is divorced from work, so might be ignorant to the risk that they face. So how do we actually mitigate the human risk? How do we protect against the inevitable? Well, here's 7 easy steps that can help us to mitigate the human risk. First of all, let's educate ourselves on all employees on the types of attacks out there. Most of the attacks wouldn't be successful if you don't know what they're looking out for. People are busy, they're under pressure, so when they receive a question from the boss that says urgent action, they're going to click on it. Education is needed around the kinds of approaches that we can expect, or that will go a long way to making sure they aren't fooled by emails, phones, or tailgaters. Training is important. Online training only works with a particular type of user. For some users, the online training will be treated as a task and very little information will be retained. Or worse, they're too embarrassed to ask for help. However, online training must be supplemented with regular updates from management to remind people the importance of keeping safe online, not just in the workplace, but also at home. Banks are constantly reminding us that they won't give out your details or they won't ask you for your details. Do you do the same for your employees? Phishing emails and scams will often try to persuade victims to disclose confidential information. Your employees need to know that you would never ask for this information. And so it's very important that they understand their part in this process. What about repeating passwords? Our behavior is poor. We reuse passwords across multiple accounts. We use common passwords that are easy to crack. We don't change passwords even when we should. One of the fundamentals is securing your endpoints. Cybersecurity programs can't prevent human mistakes, but they can deal quickly with threats once they're known. Of course, this only works if you're following best practices on all devices and endpoints in your business. This part is within your control. So make sure you follow the guidelines to improve your cybersecurity. Ensure employees do not disclose related information online. Many organizations will have an NDA that prevents employees from sharing information. But it's still unbelievable what people will post on social media, Facebook or LinkedIn, without even thinking. Last month, Ukraine thanked a Russian tourist for posting pictures of the Russian armaments in a seaside town, including the background. It allowed them to pinpoint where the batteries were. What you are posting online helps paint a picture which can lead to a successful social engineering attack. Again, education will help increase awareness of the dangers of these behaviors. And then check before you click on a link. Phishing emails will often try to redirect you to a URL, which usually ends up infecting your computer. If you're not sure whether email is genuine, there are a few things that you can check before you click. There's websites, which will give you the long name. Be skeptical of any URL with special characters. Think about an email. If it's unsolicited, beware. If an email looks like it comes from your bank, or go directly to your bank's website. If you can't access that page from the bank's website, then it's probably a scam. These are all simple. However, think about how often users get compromised because they don't follow the basic steps. And then lastly, what about keeping software up to date? Updates keep your systems secure. It's simple. Failure to update your software can leave gaps for attackers to creep into. Any threats that arise from social engineering attacks will be harder to defeat if your system is vulnerable. Even though your systems aren't visible from the internet, remember, your biggest threat is from the inside. So if a vulnerability exists, an attacker can get in, a system can be compromised. Right, let's look at the business strategies for protecting your business. And I'm going to end with this. So the first one, an obvious one, is a firewall, which is a minimum protection which I would expect from any business. While it doesn't stop attacks, most firewalls have the enhancement to give you protection. Antivirus or endpoint protection is really important. It's come a long way since the days of antivirus and will help us protect our users. Everyone here today should have EDR software. Patching and environment hardening is important. It's one of the key pillars of cybersecurity. At the very least, you should have these first three in place. However, if you value your business and you want it to survive, you need to consider additional steps to protect it. Cyber Essential certification, I mentioned this earlier. The UK government, it's a very simple certification that looks at your level of protection. We spoke earlier about backups. Well, not all backups were created equal. The hackers know the value, and it's the first thing they compromise. So make sure you have an air-gapped backup solution in place. That just means that you have a copy of the data that's accessible to you, but not to a hacker. And then zero trust. By minimizing your attack surface, limiting access to digital data, and avoiding unnecessary software, it makes your environment easier to manage. And then lastly, the most important mitigation strategy would be using a security operations center or managed detection response, MDR or SOC. This is the only way of identifying and mitigating an attack. It won't stop it. It won't prevent it, but it will stop it. Cyber criminals are not stupid. They're not going to bash down your door. Instead, they rely on subterfuge or carefully infiltrated attacks to get into your environment. And then lastly, the last one that I left out, cyber awareness training. This is the cheapest and most effective way to preventing online threats. You need to make sure that your staff are aware of their part in the process. Right, my time is up, but I'll summarize and leave you with 3 points. Technology is getting increasingly sophisticated, but the human brain is not. There's no patch we can deploy, no upgrade we can install. All we can do is recognize the vulnerability of the lizard brain and keep our emotional brain vigilant for attempts to circumvent it. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. I've scratched the surface, I've jumped around, but hopefully highlighted where you need to focus. If you have any questions, Team Riela here, we're more than happy to answer. Thank you very much.